So one of the most common questions and probably one of the most misunderstood topics around our timber frame and building our frame has been using green timbers and not drying the frame. Seems like there's this massive misunderstanding about kiln drying, dimensional stability, construction methods and stuff. And so we thought we'd just stop for a moment and share some of the details around this subject. I think if you just stop and really think about the roots or the history of post and beam framing as we have the records, which people have passed on, and there are books and things that have kept this knowledge alive. Nobody had a way to dry a timber 500 years ago. So all of the obsession with kiln drying really stems from the last 70 years of what has become known as stick framing or stick construction. So a lot of folks are under the impression that if you build with green lumber, your house is going to warp and twist and fall apart and have endless problems. And there is some truth to the concern about dimensional stability. But if you think about it for a moment, some of the oldest living structures that are wooden are timber frames, posts and beams, and they're fine. And those frames were all built green. Why did people build green timber frames? Well, it really was a functional reality of construction. They didn't have modern kiln technology, so it wasn't even an option. Second of all, post and beam construction really had its roots in getting your construction materials from your land. It's only in the last 100 years that we've come up with this idea of transporting building materials over hundreds or even thousands of miles to build structures. Nobody did that. They would fall a tree, they would use it to build a structure within a few hundred feet of where the tree used to live, and there it was. And so there was no need for kiln drying, first of all, because they didn't need to transport anything very far. Whereas today, a log goes from maybe 20, 30, 50 miles in the forest to a mill. So it goes over 50 miles on paved roads. Then it goes through a mill, and then it goes back on a truck and is driven tens, hundreds, or even thousands of miles to a lumber yard. And then it's transported again from the lumber yard to wherever the building site is. So that log has a multi-hundred or multi-thousand mile journey. So the reason that's an issue is weight becomes a problem when you start moving things over long distances. So moving green timbers over long distances, it's not very economical. But moving timbers over long distances also isn't economical. So we don't dry timbers because we're not moving them very far. Doesn't make sense to do so. So some timber frames are dried. There are timber framing companies out there who do have modern kilns of different variation of types, and they do dry the timbers, but it has a very real consequence in that wood. For example, in order to generate a 10-inch by 10-inch beam that is kiln dried, you're going to need to saw a 12-inch by 12-inch beam. And then while that beam is being dried very fast, maybe in 2 months or so, in a 110 degree environment, it will twist. And then the beam must be taken back out and put back through a saw to generate the 10-inch by 10-inch beam that is square. So you have a tremendous amount of waste in using dried timbers to build a timber frame. These companies that kiln dry their timber frames typically do not use, wooden joinery, which kind of is another technology that has come from the last 100 to 150 years, which is steel. They're using almost exclusively steel bracketry. that circumvents the need for wood joinery. So it doesn't matter if the timber is wet or dry, because the steel doesn't really have any bearing on the moisture content of the wood. Whereas when you cut joinery in a piece of wood the size of these timbers, green timber is much easier to work with. It's more forgiving, it's easier on your chisels, it's not nearly as abusive to the cutting edge, and it's more pleasurable to work with. So you can shave off very small amounts instead of ending up with a lot of splintering, which is a byproduct of drying the timber. So I want to just address a couple of things about kiln drying, because it seems like there's a really big misunderstanding about how kiln dried lumber works. For whatever reason, the general population seems to think that when you buy lumber from the lumberyard, it's dry. And anybody who's been around any amount of lumber knows that a unit of lumber is full of all kinds of junk. It is very rare to get stable lumber, especially for like dimensional lumber, structural lumber for framing, which is what we're all talking about here. We're not talking about cabinetry or furniture. We're talking about a structure. So when they take that wood and put it through a kiln, oftentimes the lumber is dried as a unit, which means it is completely banded together and placed in a kiln. And then it's heated to a pretty high temperature for a few days, or sometimes only a few hours, and then it is removed and it is put into transit. The theory is that the pieces of wood in the middle of the unit are wet because the kiln only dries the outside boards. That's just how drying works. If you stick a loaf of bread in the oven, the outside is going to cook faster than the inside, right? Why do we always check the inside to see if it's done? That's the last thing to cook. So a kiln is no different. The boards at the deepest center of a unit are not going to get dry. So they over dry the boards on the outside, and they under dry the boards on the inside. And in theory, in transit and in storage, the moisture content will even out among all the boards. Never works. Every single unit of lumber, you cut the bands, and usually the outermost boards will have cruck, bend, bow, wane, every problem you can conceive, because they've been subjected to extremely high temperatures and very rapid drying. Typically the boards in the middle are very heavy compared to the outer boards. That's because they're not dry yet. So while they often are very straight and they look really good, as soon as they get hit with the sun, what do? They bend and twist and warp. So I just want to clear that up about kiln dried lumber. It is not the saving grace of construction. While it does produce more dimensionally stable lumber, any contractor worth their salt would probably admit that most lumber is anything but dimensionally stable. So we already know that this timber is going to move throughout its life. The moisture content can be anywhere from 25 to even 35%. And in its driest state, once it's in a structure, it might be closer to 20% or even less. So we know it's going to move. So how do we solve that problem? So there are two super critical things that we do in a timber frame to help control the amount of warping and twisting that takes place in the frame. The first thing, and perhaps the most critical, is we actually oil the frame, both the end grain and the face grain. We do that with different substances. The end grain, we actually use a very waxy oil. And the goal is to actually retain the moisture. The face is a more thin oil, which is a mixture of linseed, citrus oils, things like that. But again, timbers or wood typically dries faster through the end grain than through the face grain. So by waxing the end of the timbers, we're slowing the drying process. down. The reason that wood warps is because the cells in the wood dry faster than the ligaments in the wood can stretch. So if we slow dry wood, it will be more dimensionally stable. But if you heard me, slow dry sounds about counterproductive to our modern economy. Consumerism. Everybody wants everything now. So the time between a tree being harvested, cut into a board, and put into a structure could conceivably be less than a couple of weeks, which means there's no time for drying. So our goal with these timbers is to have them dry very slowly so that they are less likely to warp from the stress of drying too fast. There is going to be some checking cracks. That's going to be a natural process as the wood dries. In fact, with this little piece, you can already see the radial cracking that's happening from the heart out. But that drying is very much on the surface. There's a kind of general rule of thumb. It's not a perfect rule, but it says that wood dries about 1 inch per year. So in theory, this timber, when it's completely oiled, could take as many as 8 or 10 years to fully dry. So that's the first thing we do, is we use oil to actually retain the moisture in the timber instead of trying to get the timber to dry fast. The second thing that works in our favor is the joinery. As the frame is assembled, all of the joints are sucked extremely tight. And since all of the wood is roughly the same moisture content, it's going to dry roughly all at the same rate. So when the joints are put together, a technique is often used called draw boring, where the peg that is used, the hole is offset slightly from the hole that is in the tenon. And the job of that offset is to suck these joints extremely tight. So as the frame dries, that tightness increases, instead of having a loosening or a gapping of the joints. So the most critical part of this is that the moisture content of all the wood needs to be pretty much similar. So for example, if we were to say mill half of our timber frame last year and half of it this year, it stands to reason that the moisture contents of those two woods would be dissimilar to some degree. And there may be some conflict because one's quite a bit more dry. So in theory, it's best to mill all of the timbers for a frame in a very narrow window of time, cut the frame and raise the frame in a fairly narrow window of time, so that you don't have any room for accelerated drying, such as from the sun, and you also don't have time for differentials in moisture content. These pieces of wood, when we cut the scarf joints for our frame, the shelter crew deliberately did not sever that cut until the very last minute, because the very outermost wood would begin to dry, and just that fast it became very difficult to slick. Very difficult's not the right word, more difficult. So at the very last minute, we would finish the cut and slick the joint, which means to flatten the joint. That way, if the wood had any time to dry, it would be less difficult. This wood has been sitting outside for a month, and I can tell you just by feeling the end grain that it has already dried to some degree, even though it's been raining for a month. So that kind of gives you an idea how quickly the face grain or the end of a grain can actually lose its moisture. So one of the first things that we did as our logs arrived was we applied what's called anchor seal. It's an end grain sealer. We applied that to the log because that immediately inhibits drying. In fact, I can tell you just by feeling the end of this log that's been sitting here in the rain, it feels dry. And these logs were cut less than 1 month ago. But of course, the center of the log is far from dry. We are leaving the bark on these trees. That's not really advisable because bugs can get in them and destroy the wood. But it does help to retain a little bit of the moisture. That's a good and bad thing. Left on there too long and the log will start to rot. So there's a narrow window of time.
Dang, balance. Everything's about balance.
Right. And then one of the things that we do with timber frames, and I'm sorry, I don't have a peg to show you. I threw it away literally 1 hour ago. Is when we drive a peg, the peg is extremely dry. So it will not change size. In fact, as it's driven into a wet timber, it will take on some of the moisture that's in the frame and it will swell up slightly. There was a couple of pegs on our frame that are on an exterior wall. And on the exterior wall, the pegs need to be driven flush with the timber so that we can put our structural panels on the outside. There was a couple of pegs that had not been driven in, so they were flush on the outside. I took the sledgehammer up there just 1 week later and tried to drive those pegs in, and they were not going to budge. So they are a harder wood than our frame. They're made from oak, and our frame is made from Douglas fir. That's important so that they have more shear resistance than the frame does itself, so that the frame cannot shear the peg off if it were to have so much tension from drying. And second of all, those pegs are bone dry for wood, so that as the frame dries around them, the joint only gets tighter. So going back to how timber frames originated, with modern technology, it takes 2 months or so to kiln dry a timber that is roughly 12 inches by 12 inches. And as mentioned earlier, it's going to warp and twist, so it will need to be sawn again. If you think about how timber frames originated, people needed a structure. They needed a barn or a house. And so they didn't have time to deal with drying. So if we were to take those same 8x8s or 8x10 timbers and sticker them like we have this lumber, and then sit around waiting patiently for them to dry out, it could be several years before those timbers would be ready to build with. So what we've done to compensate is, in the structure, we're not going to use wood heat inside right away, because it would introduce a lot of dry heat into the frame, and that would accelerate the drying in a bad way. So we're hoping to use the radiant heat down the road in our timber frame, which is a more gentle heat. It's a lower temperature heat, and it should allow the frame to dry more slowly. Of course, the most ideal would be to not live in the house for 10 years and barely heat the house so that the frame dries very slowly, but we, like the early timber frame folks, don't have time for that. So we have to be somewhat gentle early on with the frame and not overheat the house, or we could end up with a lot of the problems that people anticipate having with timbers. Part of the reason that we sticker lumber fairly tall is so that the weight of the upper boards helps to hold the lower boards in the shape that we want. So as they dry flat, and we end up with a flat board. It's not uncommon for the upper boards to get a little bit of cupping or something going on in them because they don't have enough weight on them. We could add weight, we may do that later, but that also works for us in the timber frame. As the joinery works hard, it actually resists the warping and twisting of the timber. That's why the time between the frame being cut and the frame being raised and all the joinery being completely pegged needs to be as short as possible, so that the joinery is helping, like the weight of this stack of lumber, to keep the frame straight. I guess there's a lot of other reasons that timber framing could be done green, but I'll share one other thing that is a factor for modern day stick framing. We build houses so fast that having building materials that have excess moisture in them can actually cause damage to the structure. When the house wrap and sheeting is applied to a stick frame structure, and then sheetrock and insulation are added to the inside of a structure, the moisture that's in the wood can linger. And so it's pretty important that that would have already had some drying take place. This is really a consequence of modern day construction being so fast. But our timber frame will be completely exposed on the inside of our house. So there's no rush to get it dry. In modern stick framing construction, we don't ever see the frame. It's completely invisible. Nobody actually knows what's behind the sheetrock or behind the sheathing and the siding.
Nor
Nobody
do you
cares.
want to know or see, because it's ugly.
It's not particularly attractive, while it is cost effective and efficient. So it's important for that method of construction that drier wood be used for the structural components so that you don't end up with mold, mildew, rot, things like that. But in our timber frame, it doesn't matter because the frame will dry slowly over time and we get to enjoy the beauty of the frame. So it's just one more reason it's nice to build with timbers over stick building. This doesn't really have to do with drying necessarily, but there are a lot of really wonderful books out there about post and beam framing, timber framing, and what you might not see because we have so manipulated stuff in our modern world is that post and beam was like a reactionary or a circumstantial building method that developed out of material availability, that we today have created standardized materials. Everything is 16 inch on center, 24 inch on center, 4x8 sheet goods. Doors are this size, windows are this size, everything is standardized. So nobody really cares anymore where the product came from. In fact, very few people will ever meet the tree that is supporting their roof. And timber framing is not that way in its roots. I'm not saying that modern timber framing hasn't become that, because we've become so accustomed to making things look like they weren't natural materials that nobody really even knows what a natural material looks like. But the beautiful thing about timbers, and I think knowing this now, I'll share this maybe more in detail in a future video, but we would have designed our frame differently had we known what trees we would be using to cut the frame, because it was actually very difficult to get the timbers that we needed to build this frame. And so that's just a harsh reality of the evolution of construction. We've created this system of building that takes all the natural aspects out of it, and you end up with a very standardized construction method that has no soul.